Citizens, for too long your questions have gone unanswered. For too long, these new aristocrats mock your cries and concerns. Enough. It is time to have your questions answered. It is time for the People's Voice. Hello everybody and welcome to the People's Voice Part 2. Following the success of the debut, this Q&A episode will continue to answer your questions from all over the Republic. To start with, we'll commence this episode at Versailles with two separate questions. One relates to the king escaping during the October days of 1789, and the other unpacks the fate of the palace once the royals move out. After that, we'll then turn our attention to the missing Royal Navy at the Siege of Dunkirk in 1793, followed by the less sinister variations of Republican marriages and baptisms. Finally, we'll explore why the revolutionary authorities bothered with the show trials of 1793, since the conclusions were already guaranteed. Of course, thank you so much to the Grey History community for making all of this possible, and those members celebrating their membership anniversaries in May and June will be thanked personally at the end of this episode. And with that, let's get into it. Our first question comes from the virtuous citizen Fred, and Fred asks a question relating to the October days of 1789, also known as the Women's March on Versailles. That was the huge demonstration which saw tens of thousands of Parisians impose a range of demands on the king, including his ultimate relocation to Paris. Fred asks, then as now, it's not an easy stroll, and surely the whole palace must have known that they were coming. Versailles is vast, hundreds of rooms, and I'm assuming that these unwelcomed Parisians were not familiar with the palace. Why didn't the royal family just hide? They had to know that whatever the mob's intent, it wasn't in their best interests to have contact with them. So, this is a great question, and you're right. The royal family did know that the Parisians were on the way. Louis was actually hunting when the news arrived, but he quickly returned to the palace and conferred with his ministers. Now, the crown actually had a better option than hiding, and that was outright flight. Hiding might result in a riotous mob rampaging through the building that you're currently trapped in, and that's never a good option at the best of times, but particularly once the looting starts. So, instead, the better option was for the royal family to have fled then and there. There were loyal troops in the area, and you may remember that the banquet with the Flanders Regiment had happened just a few days before, and it had caused significant controversy thanks to the allegations of stomping on the revolutionary cockade. But the key point there is that there were dependable troops nearby. Furthermore, the monarchs still had their freedom of movement at this time, and so there's nothing physically stopping their departure should they have chosen to do so. And in fact, many ministers, except for Jacques Necker, were actively advising the king to flee. The problem is that doing this could have triggered a civil war. It would have significantly diminished the king's authority, not only his political authority, but his moral authority, and it would weaken his negotiating hand with any revolutionary body, be it the National Assembly or some other rump represented by more radical deputies. And Louis knows this, and so when his advisors are telling him to flee, he keeps muttering to himself, a fugitive king, again and again and again. And of course, Louis XVI does not have a crystal ball. He can't foresee that he is about to become a de facto prisoner of Paris. Nor can he foresee that he has less than 24 hours left in Versailles. I mean, Versailles has been the home of French monarchs for more than a century, and so flight seems incredibly risky and not necessarily required. I mean, after all, he doesn't know the future, and he makes a bet that he can defuse the situation through other means. At least initially, that bet looks to pay off. He announces that he'll order all the grain near Paris to be taken to the city immediately. He ensures that the bread in Versailles is distributed to the crowd, and these acts seem to tame the crowd at least for a while. He also knows that there are political demands, such as accepting the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the abolition of privileges, and he knows that he can kind of agree to that when required. Ultimately, he will accept both of those reforms in an attempt to diffuse the situation. So initially, Louis looks at this problem and he thinks that he has solved it through a combination of distributing bread, making some favourable announcements, and then eventually agreeing to these political demands relating to the abolition of privileges and the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen. But the problem for Louis is that the people of Paris are only part of the issue. The Parisian National Guard is another element here, and you may remember that they forced Lafayette to march on Paris later that day, and they represent in themselves a considerable and a different threat to the monarch's liberties and powers. And again, Louis does know of their approach ahead of time, thanks to a warning from Lafayette. Once again, multiple ministers and the Queen advise flight. This time, even the then president of the National Assembly, he recommended that the king should flee. And so originally, Louis looks at this and he agrees to do so. But as per usual, he is an indecisive monarch if there ever was one, and Louis changes his mind. And so he's kind of stuck when Lafayette makes the request that the king move to Paris. Maybe had the crowd not broken into Marie Antoinette's apartments the next day, maybe if things were a little more under control, the king might have been able to avoid relocation, but ultimately this wasn't to be. And by the time that Lafayette makes the request, and you've got a crowd and the guard outside, and then the disturbances the following morning, Louis XVI is out of options. So, to answer your question, the king didn't flee because of the risk of civil war and the damage to both the crown and the nation. He didn't flee because he thought it wasn't necessary. He thought there were other pathways that would resolve the situation that didn't involve him losing his freedom of movement. And to be fair, that's not an entirely unreasonable perspective. And finally, he didn't flee because Louis XVI was just not the sort of man to flee. He's not a decisive and bold leader that could have made these quick and monumentous decisions. It takes a lot for Louis XVI to embrace the flight to Varennes in 1791, and critically that is 2 years away of being constantly pushed into taking more radical measures. So thank you, Fred, for your question, and thank you for your support of the show for the last 4 months. Our next question is also Versailles related, and it comes from the True Revolutionary Orr. Orr asks, what happened to Versailles during the Revolution after the royal family moved out? Was it used by revolutionary governments in some capacity, such as a prison, for example, or was it simply abandoned until the end of the Revolution? So, this is a great question, and for context, we just saw in October 1789 the royal family forced to leave Versailles during the October Days, or the Women's March on the Palace. And from here, the palace was abandoned as a royal residence. However, this is not necessarily the worst thing for Versailles itself, as the lack of people meant that maintenance could be conducted. And so, while this might seem a little counterintuitive, in the immediate aftermath, it's actually great for the Palace of Versailles. I mean, the ceilings are able to be repainted and other work is able to be done without the interference or the difficulties that would come from its regular use as a palace. Fast forward the clock, however, and things are starting to change. Obviously, in 1792, you have the abolition of the monarchy, and that changes the game completely. And there's a few different factors that we should unpack here. So let's start with the contents of the palace, and then we can talk about the buildings themselves. Firstly, the most famous museum in Paris, and one of the most famous museums in the world, the Louvre, it opens up in August 1793, on the anniversary of the fall of the monarchy. And so, any formerly royal paintings or artwork of note, these are redirected from palaces all over the country to the Louvre, and Versailles is no exception. Additionally, another big source of artwork was actually confiscated property from the Catholic Church. And with time, as the revolutionary armies became more successful on the battlefield, soldiers were given explicit orders from Lazare Carnot to confiscate noteworthy pieces of art from occupied territory. Secondly, the contents of the palace that wasn't put on public display was put up for public auction. More than 17,000 lots were sold, everything from the palace's furniture to its mirrors to its books and its kitchenware. And of course, there was goods that were sold, but there were also goods that were stolen, and some buildings were ransacked, for example, where other items were just put into storage. So, in terms of the contents of the palace, it was a mixture of auctions, exhibits, and theft, which stripped the palace of much of its internal features. As it relates to the buildings of the palace, no, it was not used as a revolutionary prison, although that would be some symbolism to say the least. Instead, the palace was mainly used as a storehouse, although there were other uses. For a time, rooms were actually even used for arms manufacturing, as well as specialized schools and museums. Interestingly, it was already a tourist attraction, and even in the Republican era, you could arrange a tour of the former palace. There were theatres that were set up for a time and productions were put on, but for the most part, the palace remained unused, and when it was used, its primary purpose was for storage, not by private individuals, but by the local governments. Importantly, while aspects of the building like the royal gates and royal symbols which decorated the palace, they were removed, most of the building remained intact, and in fact, the revolutionary authorities were making efforts to keep the buildings intact. For example, stoves were installed in some rooms to provide heat, to prevent dampness and mold, and this means that the palace does have a future for someone like Napoleon. Aspects of the grounds were used by Napoleon and his family, but ultimately the palace was not reinstated to its former glory, in part because of cost. A war is incredibly expensive, and Napoleon just didn't have the funds to properly restore the palace, and likewise for his successor, King Louis XVIII. After the July Revolution, there was talk about what to do with the palace, perhaps converting it into a hospital, but ultimately it was decided that it would become a national museum under King Louis Philippe, the son of the Duc d'Orléans, who was of course executed in a recent main narrative episode. And while the government has occasionally used the palace for other purposes, notably the Versailles Peace Conference in 1919, its primary function for the last 2 centuries has been that of a museum. So in short, it was neither totally abandoned nor used as something particularly interesting after 1789, and although there were dreams to restore it under the Napoleonic Empire and then the returned Bourbon monarchy, ultimately it was as a museum and as a tourist destination that Versailles returned to a point of immense interest in European culture. So thank you all for your question, and thank you for your support over the last 9 months. Our next question comes from the true revolutionary Andrew, and it relates to the Siege of Dunkirk covered in episode 89. Andrew asks, why exactly did the Royal Navy not turn up at Dunkirk? Was it that they prioritised the Caribbean over everything else, as that's where the Brits were getting their money from? There's a couple of factors at play here. Firstly, there was a lack of coordination between the Navy and the Army. The dysfunction in London involved the Minister of War, Dundas, who was also distracted by prioritising, or at least considering, options across multiple locations. Yes, the Caribbean was definitely one of those, and sometime in the future we will cover the Revolutionary Wars in the Caribbean. Furthermore, Dundas was not a military man, and so he didn't adequately factor in naval matters, such as the risk of terrible weather that would indeed hamper naval assistance. I have seen some historians condemn Dundas for this lack of understanding of the practicalities of naval operations, as well as for failing to arrange that assistance in a timely manner. Taken altogether, the whole Dunkirk project was dreamt up by politicians in London with primarily political objectives in mind. this was not a grand military plan from the start. Keep in mind that the Duke of York would rather have ignored Dunkirk all along and helped the Austrians instead. And so, because this is a political plan dreamt up in London, everything from the Navy's assistance to supplying the Duke of York with the adequate means for a siege, the cannons and the manpower, etc., the whole operation was a series of mistakes. It's a strange mix of overconfidence, ignorance, and distraction, which all helped to cripple the endeavour. Prioritization of other fronts wasn't the key issue here, unlike Toulon, although the capture of Toulon will occur during the Siege of Dunkirk, and so the British do end up with this weird situation where they have one siege which has soldiers but no fleet, and another which has a fleet or multiple fleets because of the Spanish, but it lacks soldiers. Ultimately, due to the timing, they're not necessarily trying to prioritize both simultaneously. The Siege of Dunkirk will be lifted before the British are even aware that they have taken Toulon, but the British will be toying with the idea of continued operations in Flanders, along with expanding the war into the Caribbean and elsewhere, while still maintaining Toulon. And ultimately, as we know, neither siege or neither endeavour will be successful. So thank you very much for your question, Andrew. And in short, there's a range of issues here, but the prioritisation of the Caribbean is not the key factor. It more comes down to poor planning, a lack of understanding of what naval assistance would mean, and political men making military decisions, in particular naval decisions, that they just simply don't understand. So thank you again for your question, and thank you for your support for the last 18 months. Our next question comes from the virtuous citizen Timothy K.H. And Timothy has some lovely things to say about the episode extra 87.2 Stagecraft for Statecraft, but he does have a question relating to that episode extra. He states, "You mention Republican baptisms and marriages as a festive element to propaganda efforts. I thought that these were just particularly grotesque and humiliating forms of execution rather than celebrations. Am I missing something?" So thank you for your question, Timothy, and the answer is yes, but. Yes, Republican baptisms and Republican marriages were at times euphemisms for types of executions. Republican baptisms in particular can relate to the mass drownings that we associate with the Civil War in the Vendée, a topic that we will be discussing at length in upcoming episodes. But there were genuine Republican baptisms and marriages, and in fact they actually still occur today. Now, for context for everyone, in one of the bonus episodes for members, 87.2, we discussed a variety of propaganda efforts, songs, newspapers, and of course festivals. And at these festivals, you would see civic ceremonies which copied Catholic traditions. Now, previously, we've seen the cult of Marat use Christian practices and Christian symbols to celebrate that particular revolutionary martyr. And things like baptisms and marriages were also copied to fill a void that had been left from the retreat of Catholicism in revolutionary France. So, for example, a Republican baptism may occur in a town hall rather than a church, but you would still have family members and friends come and celebrate the child's birth and potentially nominate godparents for the child. The practice would also be a way to welcome the child into the broader community and to celebrate the birth. So again, not too dissimilar to the original Christian practice. Likewise, Republican marriages might occur at an altar, and it might also be an occasion for public celebration, even if a priest wasn't presiding over the ceremony. Interestingly, Republican baptisms are still a thing in modern France. They're not particularly common. Some municipalities might not even hold them, and across the nation you're maybe looking at a few hundred a year, but they do occur. They're held in town halls, and they're still used as a symbolic ceremony to celebrate the birth of a child. So that's a way that Republican baptisms and Republican marriages could be used as part of festivities and propaganda efforts, but as you say, Timothy, we will be seeing some more gruesome and frankly sadistic alternatives very shortly as we return to the Civil War in the Vendée. Thank you for your question, Timothy, and thank you for your support for the last 17 months. Our final questions come from the champion of the people, Alistair. Alistair asks, if the trials of the Girondins and Queen Marie Antoinette were a farce, why even bother to go through all the hoops to get a conviction? What was to be gained by conducting the trials? So there's a few things here, and I will summarize at the end with some broader points about why revolutionary regimes, or indeed regimes more broadly, go through with show trials. But if I focus on the question around the Girondins and Queen Marie Antoinette, there's a variety of elements that we can pull out. Firstly, there's education. Just like the trial of King Louis XVI, the Jacobin government wants to legitimize its actions and delegitimize the domestic opposition by demonstrating the treason of the accused. And the best way to do this is a public trial where you can showcase all the evidence that you might have. Of course, this doesn't always go to plan, as we saw with the incest charges against Marie Antoinette. That resulted in some considerable public sympathy. Nonetheless, there was a belief that the people needed to be educated on the crimes that had been committed against them and the crimes that had been committed against the nation. To do otherwise risked empowering reaction, it risked bolstering civil war and counter-revolution, and so the crimes of the Girondins and the monarchy needed to be demonstrated in a public way. And that brings us to another reason or element in favour of conducting these public show trials. And while it can seem a little counterintuitive, there is a genuine desire for transparency here. As discussed with historian Marisa Linton in episode 85 and during our focus on the trial of the Girondins, the revolutionaries absolutely despised closed-door politics. The meetings of the convention were open to the public. Likewise, the Revolutionary Tribunal was public. The clubs, or at least the Jacobin Club, was generally public as well. Anything that lacked transparency was immediately suspicious in revolutionary culture. Most importantly, the secretive meetings of the Girondins. This gave the impression of kind of closed-door dealings. That was a way or a pathway to corruption, to vice, and the virtuous path for the ideal politician or the ideal government was radical transparency. And so to kill elected deputies without a transparent process could have further delegitimized their actions. Furthermore, it's easy to be transparent when you know that the judge, the jury, and the prosecutor are all on your side. So the risks involved with being transparent aren't as great as we might expect. And again, another element that might seem a little counterintuitive is a genuine desire to do justice and to have due process. There was a deference to ensuring that the actions taken were legal. And not only during the Revolutionary Tribunal, but even during the September massacres, we saw ad hoc trials with judges and the like. But with the Revolutionary Tribunal, there is a genuine desire for the process to be just. Again, a rushed trial, a hidden trial, would be something that you would expect from the old regime, not the new regime. And the new republic is defined in many ways by its opposition to what occurred during the era of the monarchy. And so, that era, that is the era of despotism, of letters de cachet, getting innocent people arrested in the Bastille with no process or no accountability. And so we do have a genuine desire to have a more formal and standardized process, as well as the other benefits of holding a trial. I should note also that some of the Girondin deputies that were caught in the provinces, they were considered armed insurgents, they were considered outlaws, and therefore they were killed, often without trial, within 24 hours of their capture. But before we move on to what the average person made of all of this, I would make one last observation. Show trials happen in general and aren't just French Revolution specific. Show trials may be a farce, but they often serve a political purpose for the current regime. It is often a mixture of bolstering legitimacy, propaganda, terror, delegitimizing and demoralizing the foe, and of course a real belief by some that they are genuinely punishing traitors and enemies. Moreover, I would emphasize again that many Jacobins would genuinely not have believed that this was a farce. From their perspective, they were delivering, or the courts were delivering, harsh and necessary justice against federalist traitors or against a corrupt and treasonous monarchy. It was a process for the public good, and it was only proper that a full trial be conducted. As Marat said relating to the trial of King Louis XVI, the gathering of evidence for his trial is the most certain means to finally deliver the nation from its most fearsome enemies, to terrify traitors, to root out every conspiracy, and to at last ensure the liberty, tranquility, and felicity of the public. Now, Alistair asks a follow-up question and inquires if things like jury tampering or the lack of a fair trial were published at the time. Did common people know that these trials were unfair? And if word was getting out, how was the counter-narrative controlled? So firstly, come October 1793 and onwards, most Girondin sympathetic publications would not have been printing. When the trial commenced in late October, all Federalist cities had surrendered by now, except Toulon, which was no longer really Federalist, it was Royalist as of the end of August. Official accounts of the trial were tightly controlled and would not have highlighted the fact that the trial was in any way unfair. Press censorship, particularly self-censorship, was now the norm. Remember that the law of suspects is now in effect. It is very easy to get yourself denounced as a suspect and arrested for things like consorting with former nobles and moderates, or showing concern for their fate. So the government has a pretty good grip on the press, but it's not a perfect grip, and there are ways that it can kind of get away from them. Again, something like Hebert's accusations of incest against the Queen, there would have been plenty of Jacobins, more mainstream Jacobins, including Robespierre, that would have wished for those kind of details not to be publicised because of the risk that it generates sympathy for the accused. The second point I would make is that at a time of war and immense hardship, I think it's noteworthy that the official line from the government probably had more power than we might expect today. People are displaced, they are concerned, they may genuinely believe in famine plots and the like. In the case of the Queen, she has been demonised in the underground press for more than a decade. The diamond necklace affair was almost 10 years ago by this point. And so when foreign invasion has happened, when food prices have skyrocketed, if the government says this is all to do with the Austrian monster and some false deputies who have betrayed the people, that's not an unreasonable proposition for many people to accept. That narrative is not obviously false. It's not even obviously exaggerated. And indeed, while the Girondins were not guilty of working with the British, they had started civil wars. That's a fact. So the official line in the revolutionary press is, they're not necessarily having to stretch it too far or to portray it in certain ways to be able to sell the official government talking points. I mean, after all, had Federalist Toulon not openly welcomed and embraced the British, the Spanish, and Royalism and counter-revolution? Thirdly, I must re-emphasize that this is an age where everyone believes in conspiracies, so accusations of vast plots sounded more reasonable than they do to us today. Furthermore, those who truly qualify as the common people are probably largely tuned out from the details of these trials. The vast majority of French citizens were peasants a long way from Paris. Most of them couldn't read, and they all had much bigger problems in their lives. If the Republicans were killing each other in Paris, how does that impact my ability to buy bread? Moreover, part of the issue we have here in understanding what the everyday person thought is that people that are following these events in detail and do understand what's happening, they also understand that writing about it or voicing their support for the Girondins was potentially incriminating. Again, the law of suspects is in effect. Just look at the dozens of deputies arrested in October for protesting the original armed purge of the convention in June. In such circumstances, the narrative was controlled. People were reluctant to oppose it. People knew that their private correspondence was being read. People knew that they had to be careful of what they said. And that makes it very hard for us, hundreds of years later, to truly understand what the common person was thinking, especially if they're focused, or many of them are focused on more immediate concerns. I will end this observation with a report from a police spy in 1794, and it will give you an example of the sort of self-censorship that makes answering a question like this difficult. For context, this is a conversation between an apprentice printer and a friend, and one of them says, "If they guillotine people just for thinking, how many people will die?" And another replied, "Don't talk so loud, they could hear us and take us in." Now that quote is during the height of the terror, but it gives you a sense of what everyday workers were thinking, and it shows very clearly the sort of self-censorship that's going on, which might prevent people from protesting against any perceived unfairness by the Revolutionary Tribunal towards, say, the Girondin deputies. So thank you, Alistair, for sending in your questions, and thank you for your support of the show over the last 18 months. That brings to an end this episode of The People's Voice. If you would like to submit a question for future editions, please just leave a comment on Patreon under this episode or drop a message in the community chat room on Discord. Of course, if you're not part of the Grey History community, please support the show today for a coffee or two a month. I could really use your help in keeping Grey History on the air, and there's plenty of perks to enjoy while supporting history that isn't black and white. From hours of fantastic bonus content to ad-free listening, indulge in all the benefits of joining the revolution. Support the show today at patreon.com. This month, we celebrate the membership anniversary of our fellow revolutionaries. A big thank you to everyone who joined the revolution during May and June in previous years. 5 years, Adam M. 4 years, Brian P., Xavier P., Hans S., Gruck T., Daniel. 3 years, Tom M., Nicholas M., Todd K., Jorge R., Stefan, Dana M.G. 2 years, Carlos M.P., Josh W., Torben C., Claude F., Scott S., David, Alistair B., Kevin G., Sueda, Yana. 1 year, James C.M., Lewis M., Michael H., Daniel L., Kerry W., Stefan, Will, Luke T., Justice C., Nathan B., Melinda Y., Andre G., Duncan L., Hatchet Man, Arliss, Frank G., Monica O.B., J.S., Jeremy H., Julia S., Diane B., Grant B., Patrick C., Citizen Stefan, Mike Talley, and Dakar Scott. As always, thank you to the entire Grey History community for making all of this possible.